the sudden loss of my husband, literally I was talking with him at 1 a.m. in the morning, saying good night. And then at 4 a.m. I woke up and he already passed in his sleep next to me. Many months later, I realized, you know what? Sometimes the miracles are not the restoration of like, oh, here's your husband again, or oh, here's your mom again. The miracles are really those, the people that were alongside me in my grief journey. The comfort and comforters that were along the way were the miracles.
Hey guys, we've got a couple of episodes this week and next on the topic of grief. Today we have Seacoaster Ruby Cheng, who wrote Caged Momentum. It's a book that tells her story of grief and her relationship with God and what it looked like through that season. She has a major hand in helping facilitate our online version of Grief Share, which is a small group curriculum offered here at Seacoast for folks to have a place to process their grief, something that you never finish processing. We'll have a link in the show notes for folks to check out Grief Share. At the top of this episode, lead pastors Josh and Lisa sat down with Jack and I. So the plan was for me to ask them about 5 questions, all of which are the most Googled questions searched on the internet when it comes to the spiritual realm, like Christian questions. So there's a bit more in this conversation than just grief, but these two, as a part of this talk, have a lot to say about grief, given their family just walked through the tragic loss of Pastor Chris Surratt, their uncle, and Pastor Greg's younger brother. So first is Josh and Lisa, and then next it's Ruby Cheng. If you're listening and are going through a time of grief, our prayer for you all is that you'd sense that God is near, and that maybe through listening to other stories of grief, you'd recognize that you are not alone in your suffering. We love you, and thanks for listening. Welcome to the Seacoast podcast. We are here with lead pastors Josh and Lisa and Jack Hoey. And
was Jack also a lead pastor there?
That's how I heard that.
Is that how I heard it?
Oh, did
I'm open to it. Nobody told me, but that's cool. That'd be a well-rounded team.
Yeah.
Do you want to be a lead pastor here? We are actually going to try and get you guys in here on a routine, kind of like a monthly appearance. I think you guys leading the church, the podcast is a great way for people to be able to hear from you. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but I actually had someone write early on when we released the podcast, and they literally said, I heard that Seacoast had a podcast. I heard your lead pastor on it, and I thought, wow, I got to hear that guy in a different environment, and he was so real and refreshing, and they chose Seacoast as their online permanent church because of hearing you, man.
That's awesome.
You have quite the impact behind the microphone, awesome. I guess.
Hey, thank you.
The Holy Spirit?
Thank you, Mom, for sending that comment in. That was
all right, so you broke down 3 different types of people yesterday in your sermon. Let me see if I have it remembered correctly, but you have life givers, and then you have investments, and then you have life suckers. I know that I'm a life giver in your life for sure. There's no question about it. Is he an investment or is he a life sucker?
Are those the 2 options?
Yeah, and I want to show you the shirt that I wore. If you're on YouTube, do you remember this shirt, Josh?
I remember the shirt. We had a rogue campus pastor at one point out on James Island that did that without the approval of our creative team.
Oh, my Lord.
Here's what's funny about that question. So I played golf the day before my sermon with 2 guys, and I didn't bring up to each of them that they were life-giving in my life. And so I got a text during church when I'm preaching this message and said, hey, Lee said to Jeff, "Hey Jeff, did Josh say anything to you about being life-giving to him?"
Is he being serious?
Yeah, he's being serious because he didn't say anything to me about it. I'm wondering, and I just replied and said, "You're both investments."
I could, and all joking aside, and you don't have to answer this, I could see me being a little bit of both for you.
I'll say this about both of you. You're both life-giving to me, and I think that by nature of relationships, we're all going to move in and out of the investment category in terms of like when I'm going through a hard time, I need people to invest in me, and I may not be in a place when I'm going through a hard time that I'm giving a whole lot of life back to you. I'm just like I think about when Lisa went through really hard times in our marriage. I think about Jerry McSwain and Lana.
I'm sorry, did you say when Lisa went through?
Lisa, yeah, when she caused a lot of really hard times in our marriage.
And you were fine.
He was great.
You were watching NFL.
Exactly. No, but like Lana and Jerry, like we weren't giving them back anything except for maybe the satisfaction of knowing that they were doing a good deed to help this poor young couple.
Yeah.
But and then there were seasons of our relationship with Jerry and Lana that we were probably making investments in them, and it was more of a life-giving relationship. And it's probably, so full disclosure, we got those 3 terms from a friend of ours. His name's Ashley Woolridge, and he leads Christ Church of the Valley. And Jamie, and they were talking to us about kind of how they manage relationships as pastors.
His name is Ashley Ridge?
Woolridge.
Oh, I was like, wow, it sounds like a place.
There's a high school named Ashley Ridge High School. No, but they were talking about like as pastors, the unique dynamic of trying to figure out how to manage their time and relationships. And the big idea is that this is true of everybody, not just pastors, but one bad relationship can derail your whole life. Like, one unhealthy. And so it's maybe too simplistic to say like everybody's in one category, because I think we move in and out of categories, but I think we all know people, and it's a unique dynamic for us where there are even couples where maybe one person is really life-giving to me, but the spouse is not so life-giving to Lisa, or vice versa. And it's not that you like don't hang out with people who aren't but it's like understanding that dynamic. If I see that Lisa's being cornered by somebody who is like, I can kind of like come in and play defense for her a little bit, and hey, can I talk to you about something or whatever. And so I think just understanding that helps us love each other better, and also prioritize. Like one of our rules is we're going to spend time with all of those categories, but we're not going to spend time with life-sucking people like over dinner. Or like that to us, it's kind of more of a sacred time where we're going to be with our family, or we're going to be investing in life-giving relationships. And obviously small groups, maybe they move in and out of some of those groups, but we're not going to go, hey, we're going to have a dinner with you guys, because dinners tend to lead to more dinners and more time and some of that stuff.
You guys have had to be, and I don't know if y'all would see them as awkward, but awkward situations, and y'all may want to say no comment, and that's fine, where people are obviously trying to be your buddies, and from a practical standpoint, we don't have time to be your buddies. Mm-hmm. Like, and maybe you just have to tell them no to a couple of invitations until they get it. Like that has to happen sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have been blessed and cursed with discernment. I'm grateful for discernment, but I think that sometimes, I get this hunch that like, there feels like an agenda potentially, and I hate that feeling. I hate it because I love people. I am an extroverted introvert, but I also know that part of my role is to pace our family and pace us really well. And there are seasons where we have more margin and seasons that we don't. And so we have to be really judicious about like time. But I mean, Josh is such an extrovert. He would give all of our time away. I mean, he just loves people so much. And so
Jack would do the same thing. He struggles with that.
I would also give all of people's time away to Josh. So that I don't.
Well, here's something interesting, Joey, about Lisa and I think she would agree with this statement. But we were at a friend's house last night that's a decades-long friendship, and like they're a life-giving couple to us. We prioritize them. And there are several of those types of people in our life, but also some of our closest friends today, we didn't know 3 years ago. And so like, I think the danger in what we're talking about is to get to a place where you feel like I'm all full. I don't have room in my life for new relationships.
Which
and
would
I
be
think
an introvert's tendency.
Sure, but also somebody in our position.
Yeah.
Of like, man, we've got a big church and a lot of people that like, let's just close ourselves off. But I found that God sends people in and out of our lives for different seasons. And so I just think that like the people that I would say are life sucking, and maybe it's some of her discernment, like, they're attaching themselves to you to almost be connected with your success or your position or something that they can get from you. And again, I don't think anybody thinks, you know what, I'm going to go talk to Josh because I want to attach myself to his success as a leader of this church. But I think you can kind of pick up on like a subliminal, there's a taking from you in this relationship, whereas there are others, and again, it's hard to simplify these categories, but it's like there's just a mutual beneficial, like, how can I add value? Because if I only have life-giving people in me, what that essentially says about me is I'm a life sucker. Because I'm just taking people that, like, I want to give and take in relationships, but there's something that's more mutually life-giving about those relationships. So
I would say the interesting thing too is like with life-giver, like the life-giving people in our world, I think they're not demanding our time. And so really it's up to us to actually create margin for those life-giving relationships. We actually have to pursue those and you know, because they're not gonna demand our time. They know we are busy, and you know, that's part of what makes them life-giving is that
they're in your corner because they love you.
Yes, exactly. It's not conditional.
Exactly.
And so I think that we have learned over time to, you know, really make sure we have the margin for those people.
And the benefit about having the conversation is that you then go, okay, gosh, these people are life-giving and we haven't spent time with them in 6 months. Let's reach out and see if we can get them on the calendar. It's just that having the conversation helps us go, these are people that, you know, they're not going to demand our time. Life-sucking people do. Like if you're not careful, you'll only spend time with life-sucking people because they will demand your time. Mm-hmm. And so I love the dynamic of anybody listening to this, that any invitation they make to me to have lunch, they're going to be thinking, like, am I, you know, like, that's why I don't love the categories it's in one sense, but because I don't like, I've got so many people that are life-giving that maybe they initiate time more often than I do.
Yeah.
But so.
All right, what the four of us are going to spend most of our time here doing is, I thought it was a great idea from Brittany Lurch, who does many things around here, one being social media, and she found the most searched questions basically worldwide that people have in the context of Christianity. And so she thought not only would these be good questions to discuss on the podcast, but it's really a good reminder of things that people who are maybe newly searching, the sort of things that they're asking, where I'm like, oh, that's a really good question. It's something I just assume because I've been a Christian my whole life. Mm-hmm. I don't think about some of these questions anymore, and maybe I should. Like, they're good questions. But before we do that, you came here in around high school. Were you a high schooler or younger than high school?
When we came to Seacoast?
Yeah, Seacoast.
Oh, no, I was 11.
You were 11, and so these guys were like college age. Tell me because you guys are all more old school than me. Like I feel really old school. Like Priscilla and I started attending here in 2002, so that's 23 years ago, and then we came on staff in 2005. So that's longer than most people.
We'll find out the answer, but my guess is that I am 5 years older than Jack.
How old are you?
45.
I turned 42 in a few weeks.
So I'm only 3 years older.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I just remember me as like a high school leader and Jack being a little bit younger. I knew it wasn't
and y'all are how many years apart, you two?
I'll be 44 in next month.
So we're about 18
months apart.
Gotcha. Interesting. So these guys were youth leaders. Do you remember them as youth leaders, or?
So, it's funny. Like, so the place that at least I got to know the two of you best was the Panama trip.
Oh yeah.
Before that,
Wait,
I don't
give me a.
So
when you were how old? Was the Panama
it was
trip?
1996.
I was 17.
I would have been just out of high
98.
school.
It had to be
She would
98.
have been
Right.
she would have been a senior in high school, and you would have probably been like a freshman.
So
or
It was between
98.
my-
I was 15.
Gotcha. It's like a mission trip.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a
month
youth.
long.
It was
mission trip.
month
Yeah.
long
Dang.
in very remote islands of Panama, the San Blas Islands. No running water, no electricity. We had like electricity for like a couple hours every night, but we had to row a dugout canoe to the jungle, and we had to harvest food
Yeah.
and bake bread and
Yeah.
bring water to like a purification system. I mean, it was legit.
Yeah.
It honestly, I think was a really good growing up, like, and it just made you grateful for like plumbing, you know, because the bathroom situation over there was.
Yeah.
So were you like, man, I really like these two. They're pretty awesome. Were you guys a couple?
Oh no! Well, we were passing notes through.
So on this trip,
his
you guys
sisters.
weren't together.
Well,
No, there
he
was
wasn't- we weren't
growing
allowed to
interest
be.
between each other, but we were not a couple.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
So that
our
was
youth pastor-
before the ski lift broke
No,
down?
No,
this
no.
was the summer after the
Okay.
ski lift broke
Okay.
down.
Yeah, but we weren't allowed to date because he
That's
was
right.
an intern
That's
and
right.
I
You
was
got
a student.
fired
Let's
for
not
dating
disclose
anyway,
too
right?
much information.
Yeah,
Didn't you get let go for dating her?
I did.
Who made that decision? I got to know.
Andy
who fired
Hine,
you?
Yeah, it
who
was
was
Andy.
the guy who,
Yeah.
the engineer who
trip.
designed the water filtration system.
Yeah.
One of the most talented guys you'd ever meet in your life.
Yeah.
So
He was our
behind
youth
the
pastor.
scenes, did he go to your dad and say, "Hey, I'm just telling you what I'm about to do"? Or
That would be the smart thing to do.
he didn't.
No, definitely
wow.
not. No, in fact, Josh actually tried to quit.
I called the meeting to resign. So, full context, I'm 18, she's 17. She's a senior in high school. It's February, March-ish, so maybe she's getting ready to turn 17. But anyways, we have 4 months to wait, but we're starting to fall in love with each other. I decide I need to have integrity. I'm going to resign and tell the youth guy that I've kind of got a crush on a student. And so I called the meeting. I resigned. After I resigned, he fired me. He was like, "No, you're not getting the luxury of resigning. I'm going to let you go
Wow.
because you're in violation." And by the way, for the record, I'm very much in favor of rules that state leaders shouldn't date students.
Yeah.
But when we were kids, we
Yeah.
lacked the self-control to wait 3 months, which seems so silly right now in hindsight. But
Well, you say lack. I mean, like we hadn't even held hands, like when we, like we.
yeah, this
we
was
were,
very much a Christian
We were
relationship. but-
emotionally moving
Yeah.
very fast,
Yeah.
but not physically.
Yeah. That's cool. I think it's that's like we just went back 27 years. You've been
Yeah.
in church community.
I will say real quick, I do think it's worth pointing out though that Andy also is quite proud of the relationships that he feels that he fostered along. Every time I see him, he reminds me that he told me that I should marry Laura, like right soon after we met. I'm like, I know, Andy, but in fairness, like I'm the one who did all the work on that, so I'm not sure how much credit you can take. Yes, you were correct.
and he was at my wedding. He came to the wedding, and like we've got a good relationship
Yeah.
now. I think he would probably do things a little differently today. Maybe he didn't get like fired because of that. He was a youth pastor for years after that happened, but I think it was I think that accepting my resignation might have been just as good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I came on at West, I was doing a lot of young adult ministry, and I was catching a lot of guys specifically who were at that age who Andy Hine was a big deal because they came right through the youth group with him. They're like, walks on water kind of thing. Like Andy's awesome.
Andy had a huge role to play. I mean, and at least in my I'd
say all of our lives.
Yeah. Was that your youth pastor?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
Andy was a huge deal.
And so did it go Andy, Sean, Ernest?
Yeah, I think
something like that, maybe.
Andy, there was like a little bit of an interim where Naeem,
I
think for a few months was stepping into that role, but then Sean came down, and then Ernest.
Yeah. All right, so I had 5 of these questions. I'm going to whittle it down to 3, and we're going to discuss how to trust God, and basically a common approach to this question is what's helped you develop a deeper trust in God. And then one of them is a question that we can't really answer, but I'd love to hear how you'd process it, and that's why does God allow suffering? How do you make sense of suffering in your faith journey? And then one more practical, but all of us are in a season where we can be pretty primed to answer this, but it's a very highly searched question. How do I stop yelling at my kids? So parents, what strategies help you stay calm in those triggering moments? You love that word, triggering, I think, right? So how to trust God. Like, how have you first of all, would and I'll just ask you 3, would you say, I trust God pretty good? Like, in this season of life, I trust him really well. Like, that's a strong muscle, would you say, that you have, a faith muscle? Like, I do trust God?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would say yes, but I would also say we're walking through a death in our family right now, and it's interesting for me and how I process some of that. Some of the harder times that I've had to trust God are in deaths that seem like he had total control over timing of like, in other words, like I've lost people who were in an accident that maybe they did something stupid or maybe they chose to take their life. Those are all really hard, different, complex things. But I can place blame in a person or in a, like it's easier for me to go, well, if that guy hadn't drank and drove, if that guy hadn't done this. But when someone drops dead of a heart attack or an unknown health thing, I can't find a better place for blame other than God. And I've found that those are harder for me. And those, I think about Robbie, which was a really close family friend of Lisa and I's that we just loved. And he just died suddenly. And those are harder for me. Mm-hmm. I think ultimately I'd say through a lot of processing, it's led to me to even a deeper trust in him. But I think that those are the ones that get me.
Yeah.
I'm like, God, like really, like nobody, made a mistake and killed this person, or this person didn't, in a moment of deep despair, make a decision that I really wish that they hadn't made, or whatever. But you could have stopped this, right. And so that's harder for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. But I do think that, if you keep pressing and you keep like going to him, grief is, I would rather be physically, honestly, like extremely hurt physically, more than go through deep grief, because there's nothing that, it's just a process. And so I think but I do think that desperation for God, if you keep going to him with it, over time, he does heal.
Yeah.
And no one likes to suffer. No one likes to feel like there's nowhere I can go. There's no medicine that will help. There's nothing that can take the ache away. But God can heal. And I would say through many different seasons of our life that were extremely difficult. I think about my mom having, major diagnosis and having to have major surgery. And we really had no idea if she was going to make it through it or not. And that desperation for God, it's, sometimes it goes the way you want and sometimes it doesn't. For her, it went the way we wanted. For Robbie, it didn't. And like Josh said, those are the times where it's like questioning God. Like, why would you do this? Why would a good God, a good father allow this? Like, this does not make sense. But ultimately, that's the fork in the road. You're going to choose to trust God, or you're going to get bitter and decide that you're not. And ultimately, that path leads to a life of destruction. If you choose the path of trusting him, he will be faithful.
Well, and I'll just say for me, what's helped is like, it's not just a blind trust it's actually led me to deeper exploration about the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, if what the Bible says about heaven is real and God's perspective is bigger than mine, I can find a place for maybe why God allowed something like that to happen right now in light of eternity, which is a perspective I don't get to look at. I don't see it very clearly right now, but I also don't think about it a lot. I think we think of this life as what we have. And so I think it takes you to asking deeper questions. And like to Lisa's point, with the right heart, those questions have helped me to get to a place of deeper trust in him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had, I've got a friend who, last year, I think late spring, early summer, so he lost one of his boys. I think he was 11, 12, in just a freak dirt bike accident. And he was, so I'm in a text thread with like a dozen other guys who all went to college together. And so he's talking about this, but then, he kind of shared the eulogy that he wrote for him. But part of it, he shared the story where a few days after the accident, he and some other dads of his son's friends, and then my friend's other son, his younger son, they all went walking through the woods because this kid, he loved to walk outside. And so they went on one of his favorite trails to honor his memory. And he went everywhere barefoot. So all these dads and boys went walking barefoot. And my friend said that his other younger son, walking barefoot, at one point he almost stepped on a rattlesnake. He was right there. But the snake just went away. And I felt like that, like those two things, like I still think about that almost every day because it feels like one of the most profound mysteries that I've ever heard. Because like when something horrible happens, you can have that, like, do I still trust God? And you can say, yes, I still trust you, God. And something great happens. It's like, I trust you, God. You take care of me. But it's like, I feel like for me, the thing that, I wrestle with is what does it mean to trust the God who asks one family to walk through both of those things almost at the same time? Like one son is senselessly taken and one son is senselessly spared. And God is equally in both of those things, right? Not to say he caused both of those things, but like God is equally God in both of those circumstances. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to trust that God? You know what I'm saying? Because the family who's only has a son that's spared can easily explain why they trust God. And the family who only has a son that is lost can explain, yeah, I trust God despite this. Yeah. But it's almost like, for me, if that's me, I think it's almost harder for me to trust God when he does both of those things. But I feel like that's the, and I think that's the thing is, I think that's maybe some of what, and my friend's, he's an amazing guy. He's such a better man than I am. For him, it's what it comes down to is like, I trust God because like, I trust that like he's sovereign in all things. And that's kind of, for him, that's enough. But I think like, that's almost like, for me, it's the, Jesus in Gethsemane. It's like, what you're asking me to do, I don't want to do, even though he is fully aware of the goodness of God. And, I think for him, it's like am I obedient? And I do think there is a trust there as well. Right. And that's what it's like, it is almost unanswerable because, it's like, what is enough for my friend? I don't know if that would be enough for me if I face that. And I don't want to assume it would. Yeah. It's like, you have to, like, do you trust God? It's like, well, what are you needing him to be? you can demand things of God, or you can demand that he approach things in a certain way. And he might say to you, it's like, I'm sorry, but that's not what I'm doing here.
Right. Do you trust God because you have God, or do you trust God because of what you're...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have found for me recently that, and hopefully y'all don't roll your eyes and then second guess whether or not I should be on staff, but it's been...
It would be definitely third, fourth, maybe fifth guess.
But I have really made a commitment to, and I've done this before, but I just feel like I'm in a fresher stage of my spirituality where I've shed the legalism and it's all coming from desire. And so I really desire to pray without ceasing. And that's it. What feels like happens is that it goes from a passive trust to like an active trust. Like, I don't feel like there's ever a time in my life where I'm just like, I just don't trust God, but I'm not thinking about it, and it's not an active part of my life on the forefront unless I'm continually seeking God through prayer. And that's been a big one. So let's transition to God allowing suffering, which we've already talked about a lot, and trusting God. But I've heard it put this way, that if we didn't believe in a final rescue and a final redemption of all things, that Jesus will win, there is a full victory in the future, then we would have reason to doubt God's goodness, because we look around, we're like, there's a lot of jacked up stuff. If there wasn't going to be a finality to it that we believed in, be like, God is not the greatest God. But the fact that we see suffering and we have hope that God's going to fix it all, and even that thought is beyond our comprehension. It's like, okay, God is all loving, God is all powerful, and we're going to see that come to fruition. But that's a very common question. Why does God allow suffering? We can't really answer it, I guess.
Yeah, but I do think that one of the things I've been thinking about as a pastor of Seacoast, we met a week or two ago about just series that we're going to do in the coming year, and have been feeling this desire to help learn myself, but also help our church understand a theology of suffering that's healthy. Because I think that there's, of course, pendulums and ditches we can get into, like, God enjoys our suffering. I don't believe that. God's going to protect me from all suffering. I don't believe that. But I just think if you had asked that question to any of the disciples in first century Israel after Jesus had died on the cross, it's like, man, 11 out of 12 of them were crucified or killed for their belief. They understood, like, they had this even if type of faith. I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are like, hey, we trust that God's going to save us.
But even if he
doesn't, like, throw us in, we're not going to bow, we're not going to surrender. And so
it was almost a part of being a Christian at that time. I mean, is that safe to say that's what you're signing up for?
Yeah. This isn't a religion that's established, or a government religion, or like, we just don't have can't understand the context of what they were walking through and living in those days, and the ridicule and persecution that they would have got for identifying themselves as a Christ follower. And so, and I don't know why God is, of course, we do that, and then we suffer a loss in our family, that same week that we have that meeting. And so it's like, maybe I happen to be reading Job during that time. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll never read Job again, and protect myself and insulate myself from suffering. I play these little mental games, but I do think that it's a process that all of us who are believers go through, of like this faith in God that he's going to protect me and bless me and all that I do, versus this faith that's like, okay, we're all going to have the phone call. Like, we're all going to go through the diagnosis, and it'll look different for every one of us, but like, suffering's included in the package. And I'm hoping to explore it even more, and like, help lead our church to a place of like trust in God in spite of the suffering, versus in the hopes that my trust in God might swing the pendulum of suffering away from me more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think too, we live in a fallen world, and free will means that, people get to choose, and people can cause suffering for other people. I think God allows things to happen to our life also because he's chosen to give us free will. And, sometimes, it's like one of those things where you wish you could have an a la carte option. Like, I'll take, trusting you and free will, unless that free will means that it's going to inflict harm on me. And that's just not, you either have free will or you don't. And so I think a lot of times the suffering is at the free will of someone else. But I do think God also allows suffering because it does create a desperation and a get your attention, hey, remember the big picture. I think people are more open to the conversation of what does the afterlife look like when they lose someone they care about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of times suffering will often create, as much as I hate to say it, but an opportunity for us to turn to God.
Mm-hmm. All right. I love it. So we'll wrap it here, and everybody just go around and give one little piece of advice as far as how to stop yelling at your kids. I would say, remember that kids are supposed to make mistakes. That's what you're there for as a parent, is to help them through mistakes. So maybe think through, why are you angry? And then I think a very practical thing is, if you can feel the emotion of anger, then don't deal with the situation then.
Yes.
Maybe just say, hey, I need some space right now.
Yes.
We'll talk later. So that's my little advice. What would you say as a parent if somebody's struggling with yelling at their kids?
Yeah, well, I am that parent. This is one that I've thought of lately, just because I think about my boys, and it's like, well, I think one is like, what does your kid need? Like, who are your children? Because what my kids need, is not necessarily what another person's kids might need. But the thing I think about a lot lately is that I'm trying to think to myself, because my anger comes quickly for me. Came quickly to my dad too. My dad is someone who is very patient and kind and quiet, but he's also someone who gets angry very quickly and very easily. And I think that's actually why he is such a patient and kind person, because he knows that about himself and he's worked on his whole life. So for me, one of the things that I think of a lot is Romans 2:4, where it says, it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. Because I don't just want my kids to be better, I want them to thrive. And so how do I get them to thrive? It's like, well, I can't yell them into thriving. And it's like, how does God treat me? Right? And sometimes do I think God is a little bit stern with me? Yeah, 100%. But it's the sternness is a part of his kindness. And so for me, it's I think it's the kindness of God that leads me to repentance. And so I want to, I'm going to try and be kind, because that is, not just, it's not just, it gets me what I want, but it shows them, a part of me that that's the part of me I want them to take away.
I love that advice.
Well, I would say parenting is the pathway out of selfishness. You don't realize how selfish you are until you have children, and you want your sleep and your meal, and nothing is yours anymore. Everything is everybody's. And I would just say, and I've struggled with this one because maybe just my personality, but I've grown a ton in it, I would say. But I still have my weak days. But I really do believe that that the Holy Spirit will develop that the fruit of patience, especially when you have toddlers. Yeah. Because I think when you're raising toddlers, there isn't a more innocent creature on the planet is these little beautiful little toddlers, But man, can they test your patience. I do think like surrounding yourself with people who want to parent their kids in a way that Josh always says, you're never more out of control than when you're yelling at your kids. Why do you yell? Because you want to be in control. And so, that whole idea of surrounding yourself with people who are going to speak life and remind you, hey, you can do this. I would just say making sure you're surrounding yourself with people who desire to raise their kids in a godly way, and you're seeking that wisdom and those like the 10-second rule where I'm just going to breathe for 10 seconds and not say a word. And I often say, I need a moment. Give me a moment. And there's nothing more maddening than that when they keep talking. And then I just immediately walk away and shut the door behind me. So.
Yeah. You want to close out?
My advice would be like, so our relationship with our kids is so unique and different than any other relationship that we have. But I would say when it comes to yelling at your kids, think of them like any other relationship that you have. Like there's no relationship that we have that yelling solves those problems. Like we all work together. We've had moments of conflict where we've had to work through, I know that it's not an effective strategy to start screaming at Joey. Joey, what did you do with that pot? Because it's going to escalate and so I would just say, try to think of your kids in that same category, because for whatever reason, we are in a position of authority. We're responsible for them. We're bigger than them. It's tempting to power up on them in that way of yelling.
And I'll just say it for you. You're not saying that they're on equal footing. You're saying when it comes to
resolving this conflict,
exactly.
Think of them in the same way as anybody else, that it's just not going to work. It's not effective. It's going to escalate them. We've all done it, right? I mean, we're all guilty of this. And so I'm not saying that as somebody who's figured it out, just that I just try to remind myself this isn't going to work. I'm doing this because I'm worked up. I'm doing this because I'm angry. But this isn't going to solve the problem. There have been times I've wanted to yell at Lisa. There have been times I've wanted to yell at people that work with me or that I work for. And I know intuitively it's not an effective strategy. And so I have a lot more self-control with other adults than I do with my own kids. And so I just try to put them in that same category and maybe find a little bit of self-control with them too. Yep. So.
Can I say one more thing? I just think too, the relationship is damaged when you yell at someone. Like if I were to scream at one of you, you'd be like, oh, well, I'm not approaching her about that, any of those, any hard things. And so it can, it really chips away at trust. And so I don't know. I think that with our kids, especially now that, we have 2 teenagers and an 11-year-old, and, giving them space to make mistakes, and making sure, again, we don't have this, in the bag where we still work on it constantly. But every time, and especially like going back and apologizing, I can't tell you, I just being willing as a parent to quickly apologize to your kids when you do lose it goes so far, because you have the opportunity to build relationship with your kids. And more so than ever in our parenting life, I want awesome relationships with our kids, even when they don't have to have a relationship with me. And so how we handle them and their hearts now is really going to determine whether or not they come back when they don't have to, And so I want to parent our kids in such a way where relationship is the goal. Mm-hmm. It is the goal. Does that mean that we're going to not still develop character in them and correct them? No. In fact, I think we're required to do that. We need to do that. That's how loving them is. But if we're just after behavior modification without really building those relationships, apologizing when we need to apologize, helping them understand what made us angry, then, we're really chipping away at the trust and potentially the relationship after they can leave home.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Ephesians 3:20. Go ahead.
And now to
Come on.
It's good to see you. This has kind of been a long time coming. We've had this scheduled, I think, since before Christmas. You doing all right?
Yes, yeah, it has been. Well, thank you for asking me to do this. And I have never done this. So
yeah. Well, awesome.
Yes.
Are you in Anderson? Do I have that right?
I am. Okay. Yeah, Anderson. Yep, South Carolina.
I think Ryan Scott, who's another pastor here, said that you're a part of the Grief Share at the Greenville campus. Tell us how you're affiliated here, or what are you a part of this church?
Yeah, so I actually attended Seacoast way back in 2017 ever since. I used to live in Charleston, but we moved now to Anderson. So that's why, so I was in the Mount Pleasant campus. And when I lost my husband, I then attended Grief Share. Gosh, that was 2019? No, 2019, I attended Grief Share and have been helping to facilitate for the last 4 years now. Wow. And even though I moved, I am still part of the virtual campus because that's the church I watch every Sunday. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm like, Pastor Josh.
I could tell when you signed on. I was like, she's kind of excited to see Josh Walters here.
Yes, I'm like, oh my.
That's sweet. Well, Ruby, I tell you what, I love I want to say it's been maybe the last 2 or 3 years getting to spend some time with the Grief Share class, both here in Mount Pleasant, and I've gone online a time or two. But it's just been so sweet, only because, a lot of people can't identify with your success and whatever your story is, but everybody can relate with pain. And man, there's no pain quite like grief. And so it's been sweet online to have folks all over the country that have lost someone they love, that are in a season of grief and looking for healing, to be able to, really get close to one another online. So thank you so much for leading and staying involved in that way. That's just awesome.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Seacoast, I love you guys. That's why I stayed and help out. So and Grief Share is a huge part of it. So
yeah. So you're part of the family. That's awesome. You recognize Josh Walters. I don't know if you're familiar with Lynne Stroy, but both of them have pretty significant stories of grief. And so I was telling them, the three of us are sitting here with you to learn from you, learn your story, hear about your book. And then I also want them to jump in with their perspectives and experiences with grief. And, I know you are on a screen, but I want us to all feel like we're kind of in small group, just talking to each other and learning from each other. So it's interesting, Josh and Lynne, to just come right out and ask this question. I would say probably don't recommend doing this with a stranger, but I love you guys, and y'all are my friends, and we're podcasting. So I'll just jump right in there and say, what is your most significant story of grief for our listeners? I think I know, but and it may be one or two, but when you think of grief in your life, and I want Ruby to hear, a little bit of y'all's stories too, where does your mind go? We can start with you, Lynne.
Yeah, my brother. Yeah. So my brother passing, and that all grief is complicated, but my brother passed 5 months after one of my best friends from college. So those two are lumped together.
Wow.
That was the hardest year and a half of my life. But definitely my brother. But also I was in the middle of grieving losing a friend at such a young age, and then lost my brother suddenly. So, and both of those were sudden things. And so.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And you know me with numbers. Give me a year-ish.
2008.
Exactly. Yeah, yep. 2008.
2008.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say my dad. He passed 6 years ago, and it was just a unique, complicated grief in a bunch of ways. I would say in that season, we were closer than we had ever been, and it felt like we were so close to some conversations I had always wanted to have that we never did. He was deployed a lot and had loved me so well, but I really didn't come to see a lot of that until later in life. And he had cancer for about a decade and really started just going hard after God and his word, serving in the church, crazy involved with our kids, kind of like being the granddad version of the dad he had always wanted to be. And so in a lot of ways, we felt closer than we had ever been, and it was amazing. But in his passing, one, it was just the grief of losing your dad and what felt like our sweetest season. But then two, I just had this, he had started having seizures, and they doctors couldn't find anything. And I had kind of encouraged a second opinion and had floated it to some doctors that I knew that were specialists in the area, and they had identified it as something totally different. And it kind of created conflict between his primary care doctor and what these doctors were saying. And so he went to Duke to have an outpatient craniotomy and ended up getting a blood clot that shifted his brain stem. And so it ultimately wasn't the cancer that killed him. But I had this grief of feeling like, I don't know what the outcome would have been had I not encouraged the second opinion and, multitude of counselors. But I just had this guilt, this grief of losing him, and this pain of feeling like that I caused this. Like, had he not explored this, where would we be now? So it was just a really messy, complicated loss. On top of, we had moved him into our house for his last year, and so once he had the blood clot, he kind of went into a vegetative state. And so him, my mom, my 90-year-old grandma, my sister, everybody moved into our house. And so it was just, in some ways, we pre-grieved by walking with him each day in faith, but kind of seeing where this was heading. And so, just a really difficult but beautiful grief. So
you're like, thanks, Joey, for letting me revisit this.
Yeah, great talk.
Yeah, great way to start my day. Why do you, Ruby, and do y'all think it's just as simple as, we talk about it all the time, but people are uncomfortable with being around grief and actually sitting in it with someone? They don't like to do it. Does it really just boil down to it's just uncomfortable? Like, do you think there's more to it, or it's just simply uncomfortable, so we don't like it?
Yeah, I think that's the primary. As a friend, you want to be able to help meet people's needs, speak to their pain points and problems, the job they lost, look for opportunity, update their resume. You need a new suit. Like, there's random pain points that you maybe have words for, empathy, because you've experienced them. The older we get in life, everyone is going to experience this at some point, but you definitely live a good chunk of your life, many people do, without ever experiencing this. And so when you want to be there for a friend, but you have no baseline of empathy or compassion for what they must be feeling, you just don't know what to say. And even in your best attempts can say the wrong or hurtful things. And so it's just it's a tough to just go and sit with someone and reconcile that my presence in their life could be enough right now to sit and cry and hug and listen and serve, care for, without words.
Yeah.
Ruby, I know this book that you wrote, Caged Momentum, a memoir of goodness and grief, and I'm pretty sure this came out in November of 2023. It comes with the story, so I want to slow down and really let us take you in as much as to the details as you want, but what happened? What led you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah. So what really led me to write this book in the first place, obviously, so I've actually lost my mom too, in December of 2018, and lost my husband, September of 2019. So only about 9 months later. And so it was the loss of my husband and my mom was very different. The grief journey that I went through and just so traumatic. It really helped me to see my life differently. It helped me to understand God very differently, and just even my future. Every day, every moment, I treated very differently. And at the time, I was listening to a lot of different sermons around grief. Seacoast was doing a lot of sermons, and the things that popped out all the time for me was you need to share what God has done for you. And in this case, it was me, that God has sent so much comfort and so many comforters that I did not anticipate. It was not anyone or anything that I would have ever anticipated. And it could only be the reason of God. God was the only reason who can actually thread through every little moment intricately to give me comfort. And that was the thing that really told me after 2 years, listening to also different sermons and saying, you really need to share your story so that others can receive the same comfort that God has provided me so generously.
That sounds like a verse.
It was.
It does.
It was. Yeah, it was the 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4. So it was the verse that really triggered me to say, I really need to write this and share with others.
You know what I love about that verse? It says we comfort others with the same comfort we ourselves receive from God. And so I really believe, like, in God sending you comforters, and I very much felt this way, that there's like a supernatural transfer. It's not just Joey's a good friend, he came over to check on me. It's like, man, when you receive something from God that like is healing to your soul, and then you go and share that with others, it's in every sense you representing the hands, the feet, the heart, the voice of God to go and then comfort others in their grief. And so it is can be a painful thing to do because it can so quickly bring you to places of empathy and emotion and kind of tapping back into your grief. But man, there's so much power.
Well, let me ask y'all this. Having gone through grief, when I hear the word comfort, is it comfort from your grief so that it's like the grief isn't as strong, or is it comfort during a time of grief? Like, do these two things exist at the same time, to where it's just like I'm grieving and I feel comfort? How does that work? Or is it, I feel comforted by God, so I don't feel like I'm grieving? Does that make sense?
I think for me, they exist at the same time. And even still, it's been 15, 16 years. And I still will feel that. Sometimes I'll still feel grief, but then I also feel deep comfort. And so I think it's both and. I think that there are times when the comfort is there and there's not the grief, but there are times when I feel a grief and I feel a comfort in it. It's something you can't explain or make sense of.
Yeah.
Yeah. I felt like it was like grief was this animal inside me that couldn't be controlled, in the sense that like anger or so many other emotions, you can check yourself. Like when you start getting hot, it's like you can take a breath, calm yourself down, cage the animal within. But with grief, I would just have these moments of one time in particular. I remember I had walked into our closet for something and was going to walk out and caught a glimpse of me in the mirror. And I don't know what it was, like what thought came to mind, but it was just this deep emptiness of kind of realizing you're never going to see your dad again. And man, it just broke me right there in the closet. And so I just dropped to my knees. And I think a big part of it is with grief, you have to allow yourself emotionally to run the full gamut. Like there's no caging it, controlling it. You can't temper it. And so allowing yourself to be undone emotionally before the Lord and know that like He's with me, He's promised to comfort me. There were so many moments like that where I didn't even necessarily have it in me to cry out to Him because of my just feeling emotionally done, empty, undone, that in those moments it's like I'm sobbing, but man, I would sense the Lord there with me, and I could let it run its course, have all the feels, but then also just have this kind of peace and comfort from the Lord to get me back up. And
yeah, Ruby, because I'm careful with my words. If I know someone is grieving, I do want to pray that they experience some sort of comfort from the Holy Spirit, but I will almost always make sure I say, hey, I'm praying that God comforts you while you are grieving, because I don't want it to sound like, hey, I'm praying God makes you feel better, because I know that's not how it works, and I don't want that person to hear it as, well, cool, thanks for that prayer, but I'm in pain right now. Like it's not just going to magically go away, and I don't even know if I would want it to just magically go away, because what would that say about my connection to this person that I lost? But how do you think through this whole notion of being comforted while you're grieving? Because like you said, God was a huge part of your story, to the fact that, I mean, you talk about God as like undeniable, as if it wasn't for God, I would not have gotten through this dark season.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the stories in my book that I wrote was actually in the halls of Seacoast. And it was something that was undeniable, that God has intricately put together the comfort and comforters that I talked about. It was a very difficult time for me to go back to church after I lost my husband so suddenly. And I just forced myself to go there. I still remember I would always choose the seat up on the, the third floor, and there is a wall behind, so no one can actually see that I am crying. And, I specifically chose that seat. And every week I would walk out feeling, super sad, lonely, and all these feelings would come over me. And one time, I was walking out, and I still remember this, as clear as today. Someone from the prayer team walked up to me and said, "Ruby," and I turned around and I saw her. She was my fertility nurse that I did not know that she actually goes to Seacoast and serve as a prayer team member.
Wow.
And she realized, obviously, so at the time I had to tell that office I'm no longer doing fertility treatment anymore because my husband passed. And so she knew the situation, and she was like, "Ruby, I have been thinking about you and had been praying for you, and can I just pray for you here in the corridor of Seacoast?" And this is why I said it's undeniable. It's only God that can put her at that time and me at that time of walking out the doors of Seacoast and say, "Can I pray for you?" And I still remember I was crying like a baby in the halls of, there were thousands of people walking past us, but I felt like we were just two people in one room praying. She was praying for me. And at that instant, I just realized, although it did not, obviously, no one can bring my husband back on this earth. He's in heaven. It's a different kind of comfort to know that he is in heaven. But that kind of just comfort of, hey, that moment someone was praying for me, I was not lonely for that 2 minute of prayer that we were together. I don't know how much it helped my entire kind of just walk as a Christian, dealing with grief. It's just helped tremendously, and there were just so many different stories of just God randomly bringing people at the right time when I was about to break down. New friends that I made because of a small group of a couple of Seacoasters that started at my apartment complex that invited me to join. It was just so many different stories that I just cannot explain, and that can only be God.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone told me the number of times, I think in the New Testament, but maybe even the Old Testament with some angels but the number of times, I think it's a New Testament theme, where angels say, "Do not fear, have no fear." And another theme in the New Testament is, "I'm with you. I'm with you always." The Holy Spirit is with us when Jesus ascended. Like, I am with you. And it seems like if you're going through grief, that is that's really the only promise that you got. I mean, because God's not saying, "Hey, I'm here to save the day, to take away your grief." It's, "I'm here." I mean, that is the promise, and that sounds like, all you'd be able to receive.
Yeah, and this is what I learned too through my grief journey, is that, at the beginning when it happens, because the sudden loss of my husband, literally I was talking with him at 1 a.m. in the morning, saying good night. And then at 4 a.m. I woke up and he already passed in his sleep next to me. And I woke up and I was the one that had to find him, and traumatic and everything. Wow. And I realized, many months later, I realized, you know what? Obviously, he is not coming back. He's in heaven. He's not in the form that I am going to, see him again. But the realization many months later was, it's sometimes the miracles are not the restoration of, like, oh, here your husband again, or oh, here's your mom again. The miracles are really those, the people that were alongside me in my grief journey, how God showed up, and what are some of the words that my father said to me afterwards, like, and those kind of just the comfort and comforters that were along the way were the miracles. And just the fact that grief share was offered at the time, they started in the same month when I lost my husband. That was a miracle on its own. I feel like, and how I stumbled on it was a miracle. Finding that grief share session that was running, so that's how I found is that, one of the verses that was super powerful to me, it was super simple, and I read it probably 100 times, but on that one moment when I'm dealing with grief is the fact that in John 16:33 it says, "In this world you will have trouble." So it's not like you might have trouble. Yeah, it's you will have trouble, but God is there with you. And and there's other places where Jesus said you're blessed if you're mourning, because you will be comforted. So I think sometimes that changes my entire view of God and grief and trouble in this world that I'm dealing with. And I always say on this side of heaven.
Right. Yeah. Do y'all think that with a loss and with grief, so we were emailing back and forth, Ruby, and I was telling you how I can relate to not being able to see light at the end of the tunnel with my mental health crisis. Like, I was convinced that there's no getting out of this. And I wonder if at certain levels of grief, you are convinced, like, I can't have a peaceful, fulfilled life from here on out. Like, my life is forever darkened. Like, this will be a heavy thing that I won't really be able to proceed in a healthy, good way anymore. Like, do you really start entertaining thoughts like that in your experience, Ruby? Was there a time where you're just like, I'm never going to have peace again? Or as a believer, can you be like, no, God will eventually restore me? You're shaking your head. No. Yeah. That's what I kind of thought.
Yeah. It's and you see me now, but the grief share facilitators that helped me would not actually see, they couldn't see me because all I did was cry in front of them. I could barely utter a word. As soon as I said husband, I started crying. It's many, many months of just so I also went to counseling. I went with a therapist. I did all sorts of just seeking help. It was because my mind would constantly go back to that moment of how I found him passed away.
So you're working through trauma.
How I could, yes. And my mind would tell me, oh, you could have done this. You could have called the ambulance sooner. You could have, there's so many different things that I would tell myself, or maybe the enemy would tell me, that is something that I do not have control of. But at the moment, I do not think that. I think I could have saved my husband. I could have saved my mom. Like, but in reality, in the truth of the matter, many months or maybe many years later, I realized, that is not the truth. So you do go through that dark times as a Christian, and it's okay. It's it's grief is a difficult, complicated journey with lots of the emotions.
Let me ask y'all this.
Hey, one thing just to speak to that real quick is that a big part of that's just very real that you can't necessarily track your progress through is the stages of grief. And so like initially the deep sadness, emptiness, longing that your part of you is gone. The anger of, man, what if I wish I wouldn't have had that argument. I wish I would, like angry at yourself, angry at the world, angry at the doctor, anger, denial. This can't be real, but finally you come to a place of acceptance. But I think all throughout all those, there's no shortcutting the process. And I do feel like the significance of community, like not allowing yourself to sit alone in your pain, the wisdom of counselors, like folks to help you mine out. You think I'm a responsible adult. I'm a Christian. I'm a mature man, woman. I should be able to process this. It's just like, man, we need the wisdom of counselors, of comforters to help us navigate the journey we're on. So I do think, especially given how you're wired, like, man, if you're an achiever, like just sitting in this brokenness and pain when you're used to running after things, it's like you can want to,
dude, that's so true.
Push through pain and get back on a track, but there's so much of grief.
Yeah.
That both mentally, emotionally, physically, like you've got to sit in it and let it run its course.
Yeah, there's a dear friend of mine. She's her daughter and I graduated together, so she's a good bit older than me, but she is a go-getter. It's just like, you tell me what to do and I will manage it and I will figure it all out. And she lost her son. And I mean, she sees me as a friend and a pastor, and we're talking 3 or 4 months into this. And she's just like, I don't know what's going on, but it's been 4 months and I should feel better. And it was because she just had in her mind, this is what I need to do. And it should be getting better, and realize, I think that was her first introduction to real true grief, that there's no timeline there. It's not. So let me ask y'all, I was thinking about how grief. So I did a funeral a couple of weeks ago, and the guy at the funeral home came up to me and said, "Wow, you nailed this point." And then he said it, and I was like, "No, you just nailed it how you said it." But he said that grief is the price for love. And so I was thinking how grief is ultimately a good thing in that it's a signal of, hey, you love deeply. And of course, there's going to be pain when you lose. But then I kind of dug my heels a little bit deeper. Grief is good from that perspective because it points to love. But then from a Christian perspective, we believe in a fallen world. Grief is bad because the only reason why we have grief is because things can die. Yeah. And that wasn't the original intent. Yeah. So it really seems like grief is the epitome of great good and great bad. But I'm a little uneasy with the word bad because nobody should feel bad for feeling grief. But I also want to be able to look at someone and say, this sucks that you're going through this.
Yeah. It's the disconnect from eternity is what it, because like eternity was written in our hearts. And so you're right, because of the fallen world, that is the disconnect. Like grief is the thing that shouldn't be. And so there's no way to reconcile, it is not supposed to be like this.
Yeah.
The thought I think about with that is in terms of language is the gift of desperation.
Yeah.
It's like you just can't manufacture being desperate and desperate emotionally, desperate for help, desperate. And so, man, with grief, it's where that, and I forget the reference, but to your point, God is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. And it's not contingent upon how deserving you are of his presence. It's the fact that he created you and you're his kid. And there's no pain quite like grief. And so in the thick of it, it's like, man, if you can not run from that desperation, not run from the empty longing, like deep soul ache, but receive comfort from God. It's like, man, you experience his love, experience his presence, receive revelation, a comfort that you can't put words to. And that's what it is. It's the miracle of the living God being present to comfort me because I'm brokenhearted.
Yeah.
Don't deserve it, may not know him, but it's just who he is. So,
yeah. Ruby, when I think we've heard people say things along, and I don't even have to guess, the four of us would disagree with a sentiment like this, but we've heard people say things along the lines of, well, God wants us to be happy, and it's with good intentions, but if someone were to really buy into the notion of, well, God's aim is just for us to be lighthearted and happy all the time, where would that leave someone who is coming face to face with grief? It would almost feel like, oh, well, you're out in a boat without a paddle then, because this isn't God's plan for you. And I will tell you guys a true story to kind of bring home how unhealthy this can be. I knew a lady, and I didn't know her at the time, but she told me all of this way after the fact. But she lost her husband tragically, and she was told at the funeral, and I'm not knocking any sort of types of faith or anything, but this particular church, I feel if what she's saying is accurate, led her in a very unhealthy place. But somebody basically came up to her and prophesied, and then word got around, and they all just got behind her with this prophecy that, hey, you're healed from your grief right now, today. Accept it. God, at the funeral, God has healed you from your grief. And so she took that as, okay, I need to go about my business like this hasn't even happened. And it really messed her up really bad, where she's years into this and she's like, wait a second, that was not good advice at all.
Yeah. No, it is so the way I also experienced is, it's similar actually, kind of theology that I was taught before, not at Seacoast.
I remember in one of Lynne's messages.
It wouldn't have been Josh Walters.
No. I'm just kidding.
Oh, yes. And that is very damaging, because I think that if I held on to that notion, then what is my view of God? Because is God just my personal genie that I go to for what I want? And that's not even God's will anymore, right? That's me negotiating with God, like, well, here's what I want. What can you do for me? So it's, I think that the human condition of, yes, there's going to be joy and happiness, but yes, the Bible said there is going to be trouble. There's going to be challenges. And so actually normalizing that for me was tremendously helpful. Like I said earlier, I probably read that verse 100 times, but that in this world you will have trouble. Just that one word jumped out at me. And that was, at the time, it was so comforting. I couldn't understand why it was so comforting at the time. But it talks to what you were saying. It's like, well, that just normalized what I'm experiencing right now. In this world, there will be grief. There will be a lot of other challenges. Like, I'm not experiencing something that Christians shouldn't be experiencing.
Yeah.
It happens to all of us. And it is really how it's, despite those challenges, how it's like I force myself to read the Bible, force myself to listen to more gospel music, force myself to go back to church. And then all of a sudden, God talks to me through that, like different verses, different lyrics would come up. And it's just, and that's how I realize that's God's love for me. Not that He gives me everything I want. Not even my father or my mother would do that because not everything is good for me. And so, if my earthly father would not do that, like God is, is not going to do that. And He already described in the Bible, there is going to be bad things that's going to happen to me. Like one day I will be the one that dies. So like that was tremendously helpful for me.
Yeah. What other ways would this have changed your life? Obviously, your view of how things work and the spiritual, but you as a person, it seems like maybe there would be deeper capacity for contentment just in life in general, because you've walked through deep grief, you've experienced overflow of joy. Like you know the both extremes. Like, is there maybe a deeper level of contentment that all three of you may have access to, having gone through grief? Like, are the two connected, do y'all think? Contentment?
I don't know that I would say contentment, but I do think empathy, in the sense of like, I can have compassion for people's story and not be moved by it. But man, when someone has lost a loved one of any kind, a kid, a spouse, a parent, it's like, man, I feel like I have access to emotion that wasn't there before to feel how they feel. And I think that's part of I think it's from God, and it reminds us, it's like, man, we can live like we're going to be here forever and cause you to take today for granted and assume I'm going to do this tomorrow. And you walk through that kind of grief, and the older you get, it's just a part of life. Everyone is going to walk through it, and sitting with you in your pain comforts you, but it's also reminding to me that there's a God that's close, that's going to comfort us, that reminds me that this is going to be my lot as well. Like, some point people are going to be grieving me. And so I really feel like it's, a gift that comes from it that I didn't have access to before that is oddly comforting for everyone involved. I come away from it feeling like I was used by God, feeling like I encountered God.
Yeah. I like how you worded that. What's a gift that you didn't have access to before going through all this? I like that.
Yeah.
Like when you think about, here's what I went through, and now here's where I'm at right now. Had I not gone through that, I don't think I would have the capacity for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In my case, it's definitely, I agree with what Pastor Josh said about, things that I may have taken granted for before this happens versus after. Because when I lost my husband, it was so sudden. With my mom, I actually had time about a year and a half or so when she was battling breast cancer. But what this has taught me is that every day, maybe even every hour, is actually a gift. It's a gift. I really don't know what's going to happen the next hour. What I took for granted is that I thought I had control, but I really didn't. And so, the one thing that I would say I do differently now is just with any of my loved ones. I made sure that they know how much I love them every day. Before someone walked out the door or before the end of the day, I would say, I love you. And it's, because I really don't know if tomorrow I'll have a chance to say I love you anymore. So that is definitely something that I have, really take note of the things that I can be thankful for.
So it seems like you may resonate with that contentment piece because you're recognizing what you don't take for. Yeah,
it made me think about Ruby with your like telling the people in your life that you love them regularly. I feel like I've got the same awareness that's almost momentary that I didn't have before, and in some ways it trips me up. Like I'll worry or stress over medical things just because I know how fragile life is. I can be gone in a moment. But I feel it the most each night when I'm tucking our kids in, because the younger ones, especially 4 and 7, I'll pray for them. Love you, Daddy. I'll see you in the morning. And in my mind, literally, I want to tell the kids, like, maybe. Maybe not, and literally every night as I'm walking out of the room, I won't agree, because I feel like then I'm acknowledging this arrogance of like, yeah, you will, I'll see you there, but I'll pray, I'll pray, okay, I'll kiss him and I'll walk out and I'll just say, may it be, Lord. Maybe. But you realize, like, I got no control.
Yeah.
I got nothing. There ain't nothing I can control. 4-year-old, I'll see you in the morning, Daddy. All right. Maybe so.
Yeah, just
maybe
give her
not.
sweet dreams. Just say yeah. How do you feel about that contentment piece? You lost so dearly.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I would use the word contentment, but for me, I wasn't a believer when my brother died.
Yeah.
And so that, like, my salvation came out of that. Like, it was in that time, like, in that year following, where, like, everything came crashing down and I started searching for God. And so I came to him in my brother's death. And so, so for me, that changed my life. And I also feel like it's just changed my perspective on the Father's love, because even just a week ago, I called a friend about something else. I needed to have a hard conversation. And she answered the phone and she was like, I was just thinking about you. And we had a conversation last year about, I wasn't saved when my brother died. Then when I came to know the Lord, I wrestled with, is my brother there? And so it just gave me this different urgency for the people in my life, because I didn't know whether he was with the Lord. And just walking through that was a whole different new grief. of what that looked like. But the Lord has brought me to such a sweet place in these years with that. And she and I had been having that conversation maybe a year ago. And she started wrestling with that with a loved one. And so she was thinking about it right before I called her.
Wow.
And so we were able to talk through that. So that was just a sweet gift, because there's some things you just can't say to people who aren't sitting in it, you know? And like places, hard things that the Lord has taken you through, how he's like reconciled his love, the hope that he gives you for what he's doing in other people's lives that you just don't get unless you walk through it.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been that gift of salvation and the gift of seeing how much he loves people, and like just my desire, even if I'm not leading my friends to the Lord, like the urgency to pray for them. Because I know what it's like to wonder, you know, because as believers, we're like, we don't grieve like the rest of the world. Well, you might if you don't know that somebody you loved knew the Lord.
Wow.
And so just that urgency of salvation for people.
Yeah. And it is one of those things to think about, like, that maybe we wouldn't. It's just easy to forget that the comforter, you know, he's the counselor, the comforter, a friend, like who he is, met you and ultimately led you into a relationship with him in your deepest pain and loss. And so that's where I feel like the gift of comfort, the gift is what you're going to need your whole life, you know, that it's such a powerful invitation to meet him when you're at your lowest and your darkest, and experience this love that is the only thing that could touch on the loss and pain you feel, you know?
Yeah. Ruby, we're wrapping this thing up here in a bit, but I do have a few more questions I want to throw your way. And one is, I would imagine to the three of y'all, there are times in grief where you have to just decide to keep walking. Like, I got to keep going. But in your opinion, first with Ruby, what's the difference between rushing the process, like, oh, I got to keep going, I'm in grief? What's the difference of an unhealthy rushing of a process between that and just being in a slow, steady, long-term journey? Like, I think there is probably a unhealthy being stuck, but there could also be a very unhealthy, whoa, you're in grief, slow down.
Yeah. It's and I think that's what makes grief so difficult and complicated, because that's different for everyone. So my journey as a widow is maybe very different from another widow. Although I understand the grief condition, it's, you know, what's fast for me, it's slow for another. Like, you know, what's slow for me is fast for, you know, someone else. So it's that's why it's so difficult. But I would say that what makes the difference is talking to God. And what is God telling me versus what is my flesh telling me, like what this past Sunday sermon,
because your flesh is going to say, this is hopeless,
right?
This is absolutely hopeless.
Or my flesh could say, well, you know, it will numb your pain if you drink that next glass of wine, or you should go out and meet many different people, like, you know, to address the loneliness.
Yeah.
So that's and my mind could tell me things that are not true, that, you know, but when I talk to God about these emotions, these problems that I'm facing, these, you know, the deep dark things that I talk to God about, and when God actually in some way, and everyone is different to me, like what he told me, okay, do this, and when I go and do that, like maybe exercising, actually forcing myself to go back to church, then slowly he will bring the right people in front of me. And so there's a confirmation of, okay, that's the right thing to do versus what I want to do.
Yeah.
I think that's the main difference for me, because everyone's journey is different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think everyone's journey and timeline is different, but I do think there's a none of us like painful emotions of any kind, you know, and we would rather do something, anything that's gonna make me feel happy, make me smile, make me feel content or restful. Like, you pick a positive emotion. I'd rather feel any of them than this deep grief I feel right now. And so we'll do things to try to cope with that in order to feel a counterfeit version of any one of these. And so I think maybe a question to ask would be like, what are you running from, or what are you chasing after, to help you? It's got to run its course. There is no, you're going to
go through it.
You're going to pay for it now by sitting in it, or you're going to pay for it later when you realize you ran from it.
Right.
But
and I got to undo some stuff now.
It's gonna run its course. And one of the things, my wife lost her stepdad this April, who since my dad has passed away, he's been a part of her life since she was 7, and has in every way just been a rock for our family. Amazing man. And Katie sat Shiva, and I hadn't heard that phrase, but Shiva's a Hebrew word for 7, and it's a Jewish custom where people, when they've lost a loved one, just sit 7 days. And she was pretty much in like pajamas, she didn't go anywhere, but she just sat in her sadness. And at the end of that 7 days, it's not like the journey was over, but she had created space for her pain. And each day I would see it as just like the last thing I would want to do. And I feel like in our pain, you know, even if we don't realize it, it's like, man, we don't want to sit in this. But I think as a custom, it's such a beautiful practice, because it's like, all right, I just want to be fully aware of the emptiness I feel and invite the Comforter to meet me here. I don't want to get lost in errands and hobbies and other pursuits. And so I would just invite people to embrace your pain and receive the gift of comfort, and be awed by his love and presence, because he will meet you in it.
That's good.
So true.
Yeah, Ruby, Josh may have just taken your answer to this question, because we're all believers and we all know where the same hope is. That was really good stuff, by the way. When you're sitting with someone and you know what they're feeling, you know that they don't sense hope, and they're just like, Ruby, I know you've been through what I'm going through right now. The pain is too much. This grief is too heavy. There's not going to be an end to this. I just don't see it. So they can't see what you see now. How do you walk that out? Because you don't want to just say, well, here's where you could be, because you know they don't have eyes to see it. How can you, Ruby, be of help to that person in that moment?
And actually, I also remember another sermon. I feel like it was Pastor Josh.
Yeah, they were all Josh Walter sermons for sure.
Is this a positive thing you're about to say? I can tell you who it was.
It's positive.
Hey, he's my boss, so I'm just going to say, no, they were all his.
That was me, you know?
Maybe I should say I couldn't remember who. But the greater the loss, the less words I should speak, was somewhere along those lines. Yes. And so, you know, and because I have been there, there were many months, years where there was no hope. I cannot see how God was going to deliver me from this, obviously. So like, I knew my husband was not coming back. You know, there was no way. And so, you know, if someone was sitting in front of me and dealing with the same grief, first I would probably just sit with them, cry with them, just listen to what they have to say. And slowly, I think someone actually did tell me this, was an encounter, and he said, one day you will feel this feeling of the cloud has lifted, and that, but we know that it's not today. But if you continue to seek God, continue to just listen without, seeing any results, just continue seeking the right things, seeking God. One day you will see the hope. And it was true. But at the time, I don't think anyone could tell me that and I would believe it.
Right.
So, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I'll tell you and it was it was one of those, to your point, Ruby, of like showing up at church, getting in the Word, listening to worship music, stuff that you might feel like not doing or question, is this going to be helpful? But I felt like my acknowledging of He's the only one that can comfort me. So all of my inputs are going to remind me of, drive me towards Him, kind of got my filter. I was more aware of, all right, if you are close to the brokenhearted, I'm hurting and I'm going to be looking for you. Well, I was on a boat watching this kid tube and felt like God gave me this picture of, if you're riding on a tube 20 feet behind a boat and you hit the wake, man, you're going to catch air. It's going to throw you. And emotionally, the closer you are to your trauma, if you're on the tube, if you will, and hit the wake, man, it's going to throw you. You're going to find yourself weeping in the closet, crying at a song that came on the radio when you weren't even thinking about it. But at 30 feet, at 40 feet, at 50 feet, it's like, man, you can cross over the wake and acknowledge it and feel it, but it not throw you near like it did before. I can sit with someone that's 20 foot behind the boat and access that emotion and be moved without even deciding to, and find myself crying and hurting with them. But as time passes, I would say for the person who has no hope for today, to keep showing up, to keep getting in His Word, to keep coming to church, to keep listening to music that's going to breathe life to your soul. And like, are things ever going to be the same? No, they won't. But there will be a day where you're able to be reminded of your pain and not be thrown by it. Yeah. And see God use you in the lives of others because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Ruby, you have a testimony of a good shepherd and walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And you can say from experience, I do not have to fear evil. And we want to thank you for writing this book. It's clearly, as I think you said in an email going back and forth, I mean, it was an act of obedience. And I think a lot of people will experience part of their healing process will be through hearing your words and hearing your story on this podcast. Give folks an update on your life. I think you have a new husband. How long have you guys been married?
Yeah, we've been married for just about 3 years. Let me think about this. Is it 3 years or 4 years?
It's so encouraging when a wife doesn't recall the wedding date. So guys, be encouraged right now. When did we get married? What would Ruby say?
He's going to call me now. It's like, did you say that in public?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm remarried now, and actually the small group that I joined was he was already at the Seacoast small group, and our mutual friend invited me to join the same small group, and it was a couple of Seacoasters that started a small group in the apartment complex that we lived in. So we ended up becoming friends and knowing each other on a deeper level and going to Seacoast together and, at the same time. So we ended up, this is what I'm saying. It's like there's no way. Like in my mind, there is no way that, there is another person. I thought that I was going to be alone forever for the next 40 years. And, and somehow God connected the two of us, and we were seeking God at the same time. And that's how I was connected. And so we remarried, happily married now. And so, yeah, it was a different ending for sure that I have never anticipated. Never could have imagined. So that's why I said, in my email to you, it's undeniable. It is God. It's no person's, will or control. Like, God put us together, and I'm 120% know that it's God, which drove me to write this book, because it's, God has to be glorified in this healing process, because it's so different than what I have known God for. So,
and it sounds like Cage Momentum, a memoir of goodness and grief, is your story and reflections, right? And
yes,
I mean, you wouldn't put it in like the how to walk through grief sort of stuff, but I would imagine there's a lot of spiritual insight that you experience that you want to pass along.
Correct. Yeah. The lessons that I have learned and stumbled on, things that, are not true, that the enemy wants me to believe, and things that, I've countered against with God's words and with great community, that Seacoast has actually provided me, is the story, in this book.
And where'd the title come from? Cage Momentum. What does that mean?
It actually took a long while for me to think about the title.
Yeah.
But Cage Momentum, it's it's really about my grief journey, because I keep making momentum, like forward and sometimes backward motions of, going back into where I was in grief, and you could make a couple steps forward and a couple steps back. And the front cover of the book is that it is a cage, which is, the my grief was my cage with a door open. I just didn't know that the door was open, because God was there. I was stuck in this cage. Is it, the way to get out has always been there, because God has always been there. So
That's good,
that's
Ruby.
why I said, I chose that cage momentum as my description of my grief journey.
Love it.
It's good.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with the church fam.
Yes. Same here. Thank you for inviting me.
I know we don't typically end a podcast with a prayer, but could we take just a minute and pray for
sure?
Pray for people listening.
Yeah.
I feel like it's going to be one of those. I have so many conversations with folks that initiated by them Googling, how do I handle my grief, or what do I do? And so want to pray for folks that come across us on Google, that God meet them. So
absolutely.
God, thank you so much for your faithfulness in our lives, and for your word, and just pray this verse over people. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we might comfort others with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So I pray for all those right now who might have lost a spouse, a sibling, a child, a loved one, a friend in their life, whether or not they know you, have pursued you, feel deserving of an encounter with you. You are our comforter. And so we just speak comfort in the midst of their grief, in the midst of their pain. God, might they encounter a love that feels foreign to them, a grief that is comforted, a love that they don't quite have words for, that could only be explained, as Ruby said, by the miracle of your presence. And so we pray, God, that you would bring people around them, that you might give them the grace to sit in their pain, to sit in their grief, and ultimately be comforted and healed by you. That just like in Lynne's story, that for some it would lead to their salvation, that it would change everything about their life, and the gift of grief would be eternal life in Christ, a friend, a counselor, a comforter that would never leave them. For those who know you right now and are faced with this hopelessness, that life is never going to be the same, never going to look the same, God, might you walk with them, comfort them in their pain, give them a vision of a friend that will never leave them nor forsake them, the reality of your presence in their life. God, would you walk with them and lead them to places of comfort and healing? So we acknowledge as a part of our story, we are going to have trouble. We are going to experience grief and loss and pain. So help us to not run from it, to not run after counterfeits, but to be comforted by you. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 We'll see you, Ruby. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you, Ruby.
Thank you, Ruby.
Yeah, thank you. It's great meeting you guys.
You've been watching Seacoast Church's Things You Won't Hear on Sunday podcast. You can now become a patron of this podcast and receive exclusive content. Your support goes towards Seacoast ministry efforts and local presence. Also, be sure to leave us a review and subscribe to this podcast so that you get these episodes as soon as they're released. All of this information can be found in the show notes. Thanks for watching.